Welcome. I'm Jeff Carter with Seattle CityClub, and I'm here talking with Tran-Larson and Edmund Witter with the Housing Justice Project. Thank you so much for joining me. And on this, we're going to be covering homelessness and housing for the Civic Boot Camp coming up this March. So I appreciate you taking the time to join me today. So either one of you, what exactly is the Housing Justice Project? And can you just give me a brief description of what that is?
Yeah, and well, thanks for inviting us here to talk about it. So what we do is essentially providing what is the equivalent of the public defender for people who are facing eviction. So when somebody shows up to court and they're about to get evicted, what's going to happen is they're going to go into the courtroom and the judge is going to say, have you met with the Housing Justice Project? And they will send them down to our office and we will then help them. So we provide about over 90% of the overall representation of people who are facing eviction in King County. So we're pretty much like the main last stop for a lot of people right before they become homeless. So we try to do our best to be able to prevent that. The other things we also do is, Tram is really involved in a rental assistance program and some other services that we provide. That one of them which is Home Base, which is a major rent assistance program for people who are falling behind on rent. And then also we do a lot of policy work as well. So we've worked on a lot of local ordinances, initiatives, and statewide policies regarding evictions and homelessness.
And you're part of the King County Bar Association, is that correct?
Yeah, so we're part of the Bar Association. There's a number of other programs also at the Bar Association. It's sort of a long history of just sort of the Bar Association providing legal support for those who can't afford it.
Okay. And the King County Bar Association is what, for those who don't know?
It's like a lawyer club, I guess. It's the best way to put it. So it's a lot of the lawyers in King County. I mean, all types, all different practice areas. It's sort of the way that the profession sort of figures out, what's in their best interest, but also how they can kind of give back to the community as well.
So you kind of adjust what you've done in terms of rental assistance and evictions. What trends are you seeing, especially pre-COVID to pandemic COVID times, in terms of housing need and evictions?
Yeah, a lot of what's going on with COVID right now is an exacerbation of what was going on beforehand. So all of the conditions that we're seeing right now, people who are at risk of losing their home due to COVID, are just something that was, frankly, ready to happen well before that. We did a study a couple of years ago that looked at how much or why are people evicted, and when they were being evicted for rent, how much. Well, 90% of cases or evictions happen for rent, and most of those cases happen just for a month or less in rent. And a lot of times when we see somebody in eviction, we are seeing them only being evicted for the month that they're currently in. It's a very fast process. So a lot of people are losing it because they're working paycheck to paycheck. They had a temporary unemployment issue, which is the most common reason, or a medical emergency or a loss in the family. Most people are one emergency away from losing their home. And so that's generally what we're seeing. And so what we're seeing right now is a lot of people have been kind of thrown off that place where they were, for a very prolonged period of time. And we're just waiting for that to happen. And so, I think one of the things that we see, and Tram can definitely talk about this, is when she was running a rental assistance program, we were getting people who were calling, who they'd say, I've paid only with a credit card for the last 6 months, which is not a long-term solution. And so we're seeing a lot of people are getting that place, and that long-term instability is really starting to surface its head, and we're definitely seeing it. And it's definitely always had a racial component to it. The majority of our clients are BIPOC by far. And that's just because historically, the groups that rely on rental housing in this area are Black or Latinx. About 70% of Black residents rely on rental housing, compared to about 30% of white residents in King County rely on rental housing. So the groups that are most likely just have to deal with an eviction as a real problem are also the groups that are likely going to be a BIPOC or a BIPOC community.
Mm-hmm. And Tram, can you talk about the rental assistance program and what you do with that?
Yeah. So like Edmund mentioned, we have our home base program. So that's typically our partnering agencies are Urban League and Wellspring. So prior to the eviction moratorium, folks would come to the courthouse. Usually they'd have a show cause hearing that day. they would come down and get assistance by one of our attorneys. They would do a referral over to either myself or my counterpart, Jake. And then we would essentially, pitch the case to Urban League or Wellspring. And then we saved a lot of tenancies, just paying off a couple months of rent that people owe, the $75 late fee. And then we recently just did a rental assistance through the CARES Act. So we were able to provide quite a bit of assistance there. It was 6 months of fair market rate rent. We spent $2.3 million in 6 weeks.
Wow.
So that was quite an accomplishment. So those are our 2 programs, but typically we are a legal aid clinic. And so it's kind of like out of the norm for us.
Mm-hmm. So Edmund, you mentioned the BIPOC community being impacted. Are you able to address equity issues in your work, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think our work basically is that,
Yeah.
if we weren't doing it, everybody, I mean, frankly, evictions would just be happening left and right. I mean, we are, like I said, like the last person who can potentially stop your eviction. When we help people, one of our colleagues just on staff has been doing a lot of data crunching, and she found that when we are working with someone, we can keep them housed over half the time. About 56% of the time we keep a household housed. The problem is that there's like a lot of people that we don't have contact with. I mean, by far, the most likely reason you will be evicted when you're within a proceeding is just whether or not you've had contact with our office. Because we are pretty good at it. We've gotten it, kind of honed it down.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said earlier, I mean, most people who are facing this problem have been historically Black or Latinx. I mean, it tends to be a racialized problem, and there's a lot of historical reasons for that. A lot of those particular populations have been forced into relying on rental housing. And I think this is a bigger question, I think, that we have to wrestle with as a policy. I mean, if you're behind on your rent in Washington, you lose your home in 14 days. If you fall behind on your mortgage, you lose it at most by state law 190 days out. I mean, the fact is, as a state, we've made a policy that favors one type of residence over the other. And it just so happens, and I don't think coincidentally, that one of those types of residence tends to be where white people live, and the other one's where everybody else lives. And I think we do really need to wrestle with that fact. So what we do is essentially try to provide the minimal amount of protections that you're given, at least try to make sure that they are provided and that they are at least accessed for you, because there's frankly not a lot that keeps a renter from becoming homeless really quickly.
So what happens to folks when they become evicted? Do you see any trends or any patterns when that happens?
Yeah, we've done a survey of our clients to find out what happened to a lot of them after they were evicted. Granted, it was pretty hard to actually get a hold of a lot of our clients, because frankly, the last thing they want to deal with is talk to us, frankly, or anybody who's not, because it's just sort of the beginning of your problems when you've been evicted. But out of the about 80 some odd that we were able to get a hold of, out of those households, about a third of them were either unsheltered completely, another third went into the shelter system, and another third were staying with friends or family. And so it was a pretty clear, I think, pathway into actual homelessness in some way, whether it's visible or invisible. And I think that I always like to kind of remind people about this is it doesn't take a lot of people to become homeless to have a crisis. I mean, one is always too much, but even just when you think about the numbers that we have in King County, there's 2.2 million people in this county. Only 11,000 people who are counted as homeless. That's 0.005%. Yet it's the number one social and political issue that you hear about in this area, probably outside even COVID. But it's a huge issue. And if you just add another couple thousand, that is going to overwhelm that system very quickly. That's going to really exacerbate the current problems that we are facing. It's become more visible, more of a problem, more something that we are really trying to wrap our heads around, and we really kind of can't get our heads around. So if we don't stop evictions, we're certainly just letting the ship just sinking completely without filling in any of the leaks or any of the gaps where the water's coming in.
Yeah. Tram, you mentioned the CARES Act. Is there another round of funding coming?
There is, yes. That is the big question that everybody has been asking. We're just waiting on it. We should be one of the recipients. Just not sure when the money will come through, but the state and the county have definitely received it.
Oh, they've already received it. Okay. And will it be the same amount as you had before? you think?
Likely more.
Oh, okay. Okay, good.
Yeah, it's about 150 million that the county
Wow.
has. And it's actually a much even more generous program, but it's going to take time for it to get out into people's hands, into landlords' hands, into tenants' hands before it's actually accessible.
Is that enough to address the current need?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know, Tram, if you have a different opinion. I think most people, no, I think it's going to be hard. You know, the one thing though, I think that we have been surprised by. I mean, when we were doing a rental assistance program, that 2.3 million that Tram really was able to dish out in 2 months, we found that the average amount we were paying was 5,200 per family in the area. That's like 2 to 3 months of rent, and I think that's because like I was hearing at the beginning of the moratorium from a lot of landlord groups like, oh, if you give tenants the option not to pay, they're not going to pay. And that's definitely not the case. We were hearing stories of tenants who were saying like, I pulled out my retirement savings, I've been using a credit card, I've been struggling to pay, and they have been doing everything they can, I think at the cost of their future, to be honest with you. So I think that is sort of like a big thing that's been a big factor here. Is I think there's been a amazing amount of willingness to, you know, I frankly not abuse it. I don't think people are trying to abuse it. I don't think at all. And I think that narrative is really dangerous that's gone around because it's just not even showing up in the data. I mean, we've been working with so many landlords and tenants, and it's clear tenants are really doing everything they can, frankly, to bend over and help a lot of landlords out.
So does your program also help landlords as well?
Yeah, we did. I mean, try and work with a lot of property managers. You know, I will, one thing that, you know, I will say particularly that kind of, I think is really important is, you know, we could pay up to 30,000. I mean, Tram had a household that she helped that she paid 29,000 for a family. It was really sympathetic and just really had a 10-year flawless history of never falling behind. That landlord was really difficult, I actually remember. But, you know, we reached out to the Rental Housing Association, which represents a lot of small landlords, and said, look, we can basically give you no strings attached, 5-figure checks. And if you're saying, you know, because I'm hearing them in policy circles saying about how their clients or their members are suffering, the landlords are suffering, they're dealing with all these tenants who are abusing the system. So I said, well, give them to me. Come on over. And, you know, I said we could pay 5-figure checks, and they sent me 0 landlords whatsoever. And so to hear that kind of rhetoric now, and we're dealing in the legislative session of them saying, well, like our clients are suffering, they're going to get foreclosure, they're going to like not be able to pay their bills. Well, you know, we gave them a lifeline. And so I'm not getting it. You know, I think what we were saying earlier is a lot of tenants are doing their best to pay. I mean, to just appease, because they're scared. They're scared to lose their housing. And I think people understand why they pay rent. But yeah, and I think Tram worked with a ton of property managers and basically cleaned out their portfolio. I have emails every day from a portfolio manager being like, Tram is amazing. Where is she?
So can you talk about the eviction moratoriums, what they are? And I remember there was one, and then there was another one, and then it got pushed, and the state had some, and the CDC recommended some, and people argued that the CDC shouldn't set them. And so can you just clear all that muddy mess up a little bit?
I won't be able to. Yeah, I mean, you have a few layers of a moratorium right now, and we actually have a case at the Supreme Court about whether the federal one applies in Washington right now. But essentially, you know, you have the Governor Inslee's moratorium, which is the most broadest one that's going to apply to people in Washington state. And it says there's no evictions except for 3 reasons. The tenant is a risk to health and safety of others, so like bad behavior. The owner wants to sell, and the owner wants to occupy the unit. So if the owner wants to evict or occupy, or I'm sorry, sell or occupy, they can evict the tenant. And then on top of that, you have a CDC moratorium, which is more about protecting vulnerable people who just don't have housing options or are behind on the rent. It's not really specifically barring a specific type of cause. And that's kind of the ambiguity that's kind of flowing around. That's what actually our case is about. And then within Seattle, there's a broader moratorium, which only allows eviction for behavior reasons. Tram, though, has been, you know, like I said, in Washington, you can evict for wanting to sell or occupy. And Tram has been tracking all of the evictions where landlords have said, hey, tenant, get out because I want to sell the place. And I don't know, Tram, you want to fill in what you've learned out of it?
Yeah, a lot of them are not selling or even listing it for sale. I've seen several where they list it for maybe a couple of weeks and then they take it right off the market for no reason, or we're finding that they're listing them for rent again as well. Just because there's nobody checking, there's nobody making sure. There's really, the bar is very low. They just have to sign a declaration that says, that they're gonna intend to sell it, but what that actually means is they're likely not selling it. They're just trying to find a better tenant.
So can you advocate for the tenants who are in that position where the landlord says they're selling and then they don't sell? Or how does that work?
It's tough. I mean, judges don't really want to look into it any further than a judge saying. That's actually why we've invoked the federal moratorium, because we think it's pretty clear a lot of landlords are using it as a loophole, which is pretty much what it seems to be based on the data. And so we've invoked the federal moratorium under Centers for Disease Control, which is basically all about, like, we do not want people who are going to be homeless out on the street during a pandemic. I mean, that seems really commonsensical.
Right.
And if an owner is saying that they're going to sell, is going to evict that person who is just going to basically cause potential contagion, then we've invoked that to say, like, well, the CDC has said, like, in its powers to try to prevent interstate contagion, like, we don't want people being evicted for that reason. So that's what essentially we've appealed all the way up to Supreme Court now, and hopefully we'll get a ruling. But at this point, I mean, there's just legal uncertainty left and right.
Yeah,
it's definitely tough. Yeah.
So if people are behind on their rent, but they can't, they don't have to be evicted, they still have to back pay all that at some point, right? So are you seeing that the debt is just kind of growing, amplifying if they lost their job, for example, due to COVID? Just because they're not evicted doesn't mean they stop having to accrue that rental payment. And is that something you've addressed?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think Tram could even probably speak a little bit better on it than I could, but it's definitely something we're seeing. I mean, there's sort of that, increasing amount of debt. And as I was saying earlier, like, it may not even be a rental debt. It might be in order to pay down their rent. They're accruing rent at higher interest rates and with the credit card. So, I mean, that's just going to be long-term destabilizing. And as I said earlier, like, most evictions, even in normal times, happen because of one missed paycheck, essentially. And if you're in that position where you don't have savings, you don't have the safety net, then that's going to be a huge problem. I mean, one thing, there was a Pierce County study a couple of years ago that showed that, it was kind of asking the question, like, why is it there's so many more Black individuals in shelter systems than white individuals? And what it was finding, that out of surveying people who were losing their housing, was that Black individuals in particular just did not have, like, a support network. They didn't have the uncle who could bail them out. They didn't have the aunt or the extended family, that kind of, like, intergenerational wealth that I think that, frankly, is a lot of our BIPOC groups have been not provided for. So I think that it's, like, a huge problem. And, like, I think what we're going to find with COVID is so many tenants, have been just really stretching themselves to be able to pay down all those debts, and that it's going to be long-term destabilizing.
Yeah. Tram, did you have anything to add on that? Edmund said you were looking into that as well.
I mean, I think just during the rental assistance program, we were seeing folks with, the shutdowns, going in and out of phases on the state level to try to, stop the spread of COVID. We were seeing a lot of folks that work in the service industry that, would get laid off for a few weeks, but that would spiral and they would fall months behind. And then they would get a job again, start working again, and, start to be able to pay that back. But then we go back into lockdown. And so it's this constant up and down that we're seeing. And so we caught a lot of people up towards the end of the year, but, it's the state of the world hasn't changed. And so we're all just waiting for the next batch of money to, like, stop the bleeding from December till now, or whenever the money comes through.
With the declining infection rates and the vaccines rolling out, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Or is there going to be a long delay in terms of when people can actually get healthy and get jobs and pay their rent? So what do you anticipate?
What do you think, Tram?
I think we're all just, it's hard to tell. It's really hard to predict what it's going to look like. We're virtual, we're not in person. Our clinics aren't running in person anymore. So we don't know when we're going to be back at the courthouse, what that even looks like, because our Kent clinic was extremely crowded prior to COVID. And so it's not ideal even with folks getting vaccines, because they're still recommending that you're, social distancing and wearing masks, that we have all those folks come back into the courthouse to, deal with their eviction cases. Then I think it's going to be a very long, slow process. I don't foresee things getting better by the end of the year, unfortunately.
Mhm. Is there, this might be too Pollyannish, but is there any silver lining to all of this that we've experienced? I mean, showing maybe the inequities in our system, or the systemic racism, and how our system is failing, or how we could actually, change it for the better. Is there some lessons or silver linings we can get out of this?
Well, I do. I'm not, I think that there is something um, that I think we are learning about. I mean, one thing that I think the kind of big takeaway to me is I do, something that we definitely thought about before is like, why do we have evictions? Why is it that we do it this way? Why is it we think it's a necessary default of society that we have to throw people out of their homes?
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that we've seen on the moratorium, as I was saying, is like most people are doing whatever they can to keep up. And they're not, it seems like eviction has become this sort of, what I think a lot of landlord associations believe is that you have to have this tool, otherwise no one will be afraid of you. You will never be able to get your home back. And that's just clearly not true.
Mm.
And I think that sort of is like a narrative maybe we need to start thinking about. And also is that why do we punish poverty so aggressively in the way we do?
Mm.
And clearly because we've set up a system that cannot withstand this type of health risk, which is probably going to happen again at some point in maybe our lives or not, that
Mhm.
I just wonder, like, why is it that we haven't really tried to focus and try to build up a better structure, better support network to be able to withstand this, and maybe just have better compassion for what's actually going on, especially
Mhm.
because I think frankly we all have probably contributed to a lot of the inequities in the system.
Yeah.
uh, and I think that being more mindful of that in the future, at least I hope that we can make really big policy changes out of this, but maybe I'm being optimistic.
Tram, what do you think?
I mean, just echoing a lot of what Edmund said, I think tenant landlord protections have been talked about a lot more on every level than probably it's ever been. Even just, I feel like amongst my friends, they're asking about it, they're wanting to know more about it. I think, yeah, it really is just exposing all of the gaps there are in our society and the lack of safety nets and all the inequities that are out there. So I am also hoping for a lot of policy changes and stronger protections out of this, but we'll see.
So how can people get involved, support your work, support landlord tenant issue, having, keeping people out of evictions and stuff like that? What would you say?
A few things. I mean, number one, we actually have we have 14 members on staff, 8 of whom are attorneys, 6 are support staff doing all kinds of different things. We have a lot of volunteers, actually. We rely on non-attorneys and attorneys to volunteer. We've got 120 active attorney volunteers, which frankly has taken a hit due to COVID. And we have a large number of non-attorneys who kind of help us um, manage a lot of the people who are calling us, because we are, like I said, is sort of a unique resource. We get people calling us all the time, and we need to be able to address their needs as quickly as possible. So we always need help, even if people can provide that. We don't have honestly, a whole lot of prerequisites by any means. We always need the help. But in addition, something that Tram is increasingly be working on too is like, kind of engage in the community and try to kind of highlight a lot of the legislative and policy work that we're doing. And so it's really important, even just writing your legislature about some of the important bills that are going on, like HB 1236, which is sponsored by Rep. Macri right now, which is for provide just cause protections across the state. We're the only state on the West Coast that doesn't have that. And this is like a pretty modest reform. And also like Senator Cooter's 5160, which would provide right to counsel, because right now, 8% of tenants across the state do not have counsel. But as I said earlier, like we can keep people housed just by the mere fact we have contact with them almost 60% of the time, which means a lot of evictions are happening in the state just because you don't have counsel. So like I said, we can always use the help, but honestly, even just taking the time to talk to your legislature, talk to you, be engaged in a lot of legal and policy making is really critical. And I think people sort of often underestimate how just a simple email to a legislature and a lawmaker goes a really long way, because they do, I mean, I think they really do want to hear from their constituents. So I think that kind of involvement, that proactive involvement is critical.
Great. What is Just Cause, by the way? You mentioned.
So right now, if you don't have a lease agreement, or your lease is up, or you're a month-to-month tenant, let's say you have an oral lease, so you just pay your rent, or maybe you had a lease 10 years ago, but your landlord never provided you a new one, so you're a month-to-month tenant. If your landlord wants you out, they just have to give you 20 days notice and no reason. So what this would do is just require a landlord to give a reason for why they're going to evict you. And 4 cities right now in Washington have it: Seattle, Berrien, Auburn, and Federal Way. Like I said, a number of states do, including all on the West Coast besides us. It's been a long priority because I frankly think it's critical to making sure you provide like holistic protections to tenants. But it's something that is frankly been a lot harder to get across in the state legislature than I would have thought.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for joining me today. Really appreciate it. I'm sure people will be really informed with what you've shared, and hopefully get involved in the Housing Justice Project and other efforts to pass policy and legislation to help people stay in their homes. So thanks again, and have a great day.